There's a particular kind of silence that doesn't mean peace. I've lived long enough in this country, long enough to know the difference between a quiet that settles over a valley like snow, soft and indifferent, and a quiet that holds its breath. The kind that presses against your eardrums and makes the hair along your forearms lift without any wind to explain it. I found that second kind of silence inside an old Morton barn on the eastern edge of the Calder property, on a Tuesday in late October, when the land had already gone the color of rust and regret. I wasn't supposed to be there. I want to be honest about that from the start, because I've told this story twice before, once to a man who didn't believe me and once to a woman who believed me too much, and both times I left out the part where I almost didn't go in. Almost kept writing. Almost told myself it was none of my concern, that whatever sound I'd half heard from 60 yards away was a coyote, or the wind working through the slats, or the particular brand of loneliness this land specializes in manufacturing. I almost did the easier thing. I didn't, and I've been living with what I found inside that barn ever since, not as a weight exactly, but as a revision. Something that rewrote a sentence in me I hadn't known was wrong until the correction arrived. Her name, I learned later, was Sakos. It meant cold wind in her language. I didn't know that when I first saw her. I only knew what I saw, a woman who had survived something that would have ended most men I knew, who was sitting in the dark of that barn with her wrists rope burned and her eyes open and her jaw set at an angle that told me she had decided, somewhere in those days of darkness, not to die. Not as an act of hope, as an act of spite. This is the account I've kept in my logbook, the one I carry in the breast pocket of my coat, the one my wife says I reach for the way other men reach for a flask. I write things down because I am afraid, fundamentally, of forgetting, of the way time smooths everything into something bearable and imprecise. I didn't want this to become bearable. I wanted it to stay exactly as sharp as it was. So here it is, as sharp as I can keep it. The Calder property had been empty for 11 months by the time I crossed it. Old Gerald Calder had gone the way most men go out here, suddenly and without adequate preparation, and his 3 sons had divided what remained of the cattle and left the land to the county's consideration. Nobody bought it. Nobody wanted 40 acres of hardpan and one working well and a barn that listed slightly to the south like a man leaning into a headwind. I was cutting across the eastern edge of it because the creek trail had washed out 2 days prior, and the alternate route added 4 miles to my ride into Harlan's Ferry. I'm a practical man. I kept a logbook and a watch, and I did not add 4 miles to a ride if there was a flatter option available. My horse, a gray quarter horse named Probable, named for my wife's habit of describing his temperament as probably fine, probably not a problem, probably won't throw you today, had been walking steadily for 3 hours when he stopped. Not gradually, not the way a horse slows when he scents water or catches the smell of another animal at a reasonable distance. He stopped, weight back, ears forward, the full rigid architecture of a horse encountering something his instincts could not categorize and therefore did not like. I sat with him a moment. I'm a man who keeps a logbook, which means I'm a man who notices things and writes them down, which means I am, against the wishes of the more practical side of my character, a man who has trained himself to pay attention. My wife calls it a curse. I've come to think of it more as a subscription I can't cancel. What I noticed, Probable's ears were pointed at the barn, not at the tree line, not at the scrub to our left where a coyote might reasonably be moving, at the barn specifically. The listing, weathered, sun-bleached structure 60 yards to our east, with its doors chained shut and its single high window dark. What I also noticed, the chain on those doors was new. That was the thing that should have sent me writing. A new chain on an abandoned property meant someone had been there recently and had reason to secure something. In this county, in that year, the reasons a man might chain shut an abandoned barn ran a spectrum from livestock storage to something considerably less benign, and the practical portion of my character voted firmly for none of your business. Get to Harlan's Ferry. I sat with Probable for another minute. He didn't move. I reached into my breast pocket and withdrew my logbook, a reflex, not a decision, and wrote the date and time and new chain on Calder Barn and the particular quality of the silence pressing against my ears. Then I got down. Getting close to the barn took longer than the distance warranted. Because I was moving carefully, and because probable would not come with me, and because every few steps I reconsidered and then continued anyway, which is a slow and inefficient way to cross 60 yards of open ground. The chain was padlocked. Recent, the hasp was clean, no surface rust, and it smelled of machine oil if you got close enough. The doors themselves were old pine, dried and cracked, with gaps between the boards wide enough to see through if you pressed your eye to them. I pressed my eye to one. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the high window on the south wall, which admitted a column of pale October light that fell across the straw-covered floor and illuminated, in its particular and indifferent way, a shape in the far corner. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. My mind, practical, logbook keeping, 4 miles is 4 miles. My mind wanted very badly to see a pile of feed sacks, or a rolled tarp, or a horse blanket balled up and discarded. It ran through that inventory quickly and with real enthusiasm. Then the shape moved. Not much, just enough. A slow, deliberate adjustment of weight from one side to the other, the way a person moves when they've been still so long that stillness itself has become a kind of pain. I said very quietly through the gap in the boards, "Hello." The shape went still again. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said, which I recognized immediately as the thing a person who intended to hurt you would also say, and which therefore probably communicated nothing useful. I tried again. "I'm going to find something to break this lock, you stay still." This was also, in retrospect, not a useful instruction. I found a rock, not elegant, but the lock was newer than the hasp it was fitted to, and after 4 strikes the hasp itself pulled free of the rotted wood, which I probably should have thought to check first. The doors swung open with a sound like a complaint that had been building for years. The light came in. She was in the far corner, exactly where the shape had been. She had positioned herself with her back against the wall and her legs drawn up and her bound wrists resting on her knees, and she was looking at me with the kind of complete, assessing stillness that I have seen in exactly 2 kinds of creature in my life: very old predators, and people who have learned that stillness is the only defense available to them. She was Apache. I knew this not because I had significant experience with Apache people. I had almost none. But because I had been told, when I first came to this region, the approximate geography of the different peoples and their territories, and the Calder property sat at the western edge of land that had once been theirs before it wasn't. She was wearing a torn calico dress that had not been hers originally, too large across the shoulders, wrong length, and her hair had come partially loose from whatever it had been arranged in and hung across one side of her face. Her wrists were bound with braided rope. Her ankles were not. Her eyes, when they met mine, did not flinch. That was the first thing I noticed and wrote down later. She did not flinch. In all the days that followed, in all the accounting I've done of that October and what came from it, I keep returning to that moment as the one that mattered most. Not the finding, not the breaking of the lock. The moment when her eyes met mine and held, with the patience of someone who had already survived the worst of the possible outcomes and had no particular fear left for the lesser ones. I said, "I'm going to come closer and cut those ropes." She watched me. "Do you speak English?" I asked. She said, in English that was precise and careful and slightly formal in the way that a language learned from careful observation rather than casual immersion often is, "I understand what you are saying." I stopped where I was. "How long have you been here?" She considered the question. 5 days, she said, perhaps 6. I want to be honest, I felt sick. Not in a dramatic way, no theatrical response, no hand to the wall for balance. Just a quiet internal nausea, the kind that comes when your body registers something your mind hasn't quite processed yet. 5 days, perhaps 6. In an October that had gone cold by the 3rd week, in a barn with no water source visible, with her wrists bound and the doors chained. "Is anyone else here?" I asked. "No. Are you injured?" Another pause, not evasion. I understood, watching her, that the pauses were the shape of a very precise mind choosing very precise words. "My wrists," she said, "and I am very thirsty." I had a canteen. I want to write this down the way it happened, not the way it sounds when told quickly. I held the canteen out and she looked at it for a long moment before she took it, and when she took it she did not drink frantically, the way a person in 5 or 6 days of thirst might be expected to. She drank deliberately. a controlled amount. Then she stopped, held the canteen a moment, and said, "Thank you." The control of it, that was the thing that lodged in me. I cut the ropes with my pocket knife. She held her wrist steady while I worked, neither helping nor resisting, simply presenting them as a problem to be solved. And when the rope came free, she didn't move them immediately. She waited. Then slowly, she rotated her wrists and looked at the rope burns underneath with the detached interest of someone assessing a map. "Who did this?" I asked. She looked up from her wrists. "Men who believed it was their right," she said. Which was an answer and not an answer, and I understood that it was probably the fullest answer she was going to offer me at that moment, and that pressing would accomplish nothing except to remind her that I was also, in the end, a man who occupied land that had not originally been offered to him. Getting her out of the barn and onto Probable took longer than I expected, not because she was weak. Though she was weak, I could see it in the slight tremor of her legs when she first stood, but because she moved with a deliberateness that refused to be hurried. She stood. She assessed the space around her. She walked to the door and stopped in the rectangle of October light and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed and her face turned slightly upward. I did not ask what she was doing. I wrote it down later, stood in the light with her eyes closed 3 seconds for, like she was checking something. When she opened her eyes, she looked at Probable with the calm evaluation of someone who has dealt with horses before, which I realized with the particular embarrassment of a person who has made an assumption and caught themselves at it. Of course she had. She approached him from the side, let him take her scent, and he accepted her with none of the nervousness he'd shown the barn, which I took as his endorsement, which I've always trusted more than my own. I helped her mount, which she allowed with the same unsentimental practicality she'd applied to everything else. I mounted behind her, took the reins, and we began the ride back toward Harlan's Ferry. For a long time, she said nothing, and I said nothing. I was thinking about the new chain, about the men who'd put it there, about the word right and the way she'd said it, not with bitterness exactly, but with the kind of factual precision that is sometimes more devastating than bitterness. She spoke first. "Where are you taking me?" "Harlan's Ferry," I said. "It's the closest town, there's a doctor." "Is there a sheriff?" "Yes." She considered this. "The men who locked me there," she said, "one of them was a deputy." I heard Probable's hooves on the hardpan and the sound of the wind through the dried grass, and somewhere distant, a hawk. "All right," I said after a moment. "All right," she agreed. We adjusted course, northwest, toward a different destination than the one I'd had that morning. Her name was Sakos. She told me this about a mile into the new direction, without preamble or explanation. "My name is Eli Marsh," I said. "People mostly call me Marsh." "Marsh," she repeated, testing the word. "Like the low ground." "Yes." "Is that where you come from?" "No," I said. "Virginia. But I came here young enough that it doesn't feel like where I come from anymore." She absorbed this. "I came from here," she said, "and it still does not feel like where I come from." I wrote that down later, word for word. I was afraid of getting it wrong. By the time we reached the crest of the ridge that looked down toward the settlement I was rerouting us to, a loose collection of homesteads, and a trading post operated by a man named Culberson, who had, in my experience, the most consistent moral compass of anyone within 40 miles. The light had shifted to the long, amber reach of late afternoon, and Sakos had not spoken again for over an hour. I had not pushed. I had thought about her wrists, about 5 days, about the calico dress that wasn't hers, about the deliberate way she'd stopped herself from drinking too much even when her body was demanding more, because she was rationing herself even after the rationing was done. The way a body holds on to its survival behaviors long after the immediate need has passed. The way the mind and the body keep running the old programs, because they don't yet trust that the danger is over. I understood something about that in a smaller and less costly way. My logbook habit had started in the war, a different one earlier, further east, as a way of keeping track of what was real versus what fear was inventing. I still reached for it when things felt uncertain. The habit didn't know the war was over. It just kept running. When we reached the descent toward Culberson's, she spoke again. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "Probable stopped," I said. "My horse, he heard something." "No," she said. "Why did you stop and open the door? You could have kept riding." I thought about the honest answer. I noticed the chain was new, I said. Many people would have noticed and kept writing. I know, I said. I almost did. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what stopped you? I thought about the logbook in my breast pocket, about the subscription I couldn't cancel. I write things down, I said. I've trained myself to pay attention to things that don't fit. The chain didn't fit. She turned her head slightly, not quite looking at me. And what do you do with the things you write down? Sometimes nothing, I said. Sometimes I figure out what they mean later. She turned back to face forward. Write this down, she said. I will. All of it. All of it, I said. We reached Culberson's trading post as the sun hit the rim of the western hills and began its collapse into orange. I tied Probable at the post and helped Sacco's down. She accepted the help with the same pragmatic neutrality she'd applied to everything, the neutrality of someone who has decided that accepting help is not the same as being diminished by it, which is a distinction a lot of people I know have never managed to make. Culberson came out when he heard the horse, saw us, and stopped. He was a careful man. He had the habit of reading situations before reacting to them, which made him slower to speak than most people found comfortable and considerably more useful in a crisis. He looked at Sacco's. He looked at me. He looked at her wrists. Come inside, he said. She crossed the threshold and stopped just inside the door, and for just a moment, the first moment I had seen it, her composure slipped. Not much. A slight irregularity in her breathing. Her hand at her side closed once, opened, closed again. She was looking at the room, at the ceiling, at the walls and the windows and the fire in the stove and the absence of chains. The absence of chains. I stood outside the threshold and wrote it down. Her hand closed and opened, like she was checking that her hand was still there. Then I went inside, too, and Culberson began heating water, and I began the longer work of understanding exactly what had happened on the Calder property and what we were going to do about it. Culberson's wife was called Marta. I should have mentioned her sooner, because she was the one who actually mattered in those first hours. Not me, not Culberson with his careful reading of situations, but Marta, who came in from the back room when she heard voices, took one look at Sacco's standing in the lamplight with her rope-burned wrists and her too large calico dress, and said nothing at all except to pull a stool close to the fire and gesture to it with the absolute authority of a woman who has made rooms safe for people her whole life and knows exactly how it's done. Sacco said. Marta brought water warm in a basin, not for drinking but for the wrists, and a cloth, and she knelt in front of Sacco's and began cleaning the rope burns with a focus so complete and so unsentimental that it somehow communicated more respect than any number of careful, sympathetic words would have. She wasn't performing care. She was just doing it. I stood near the door with my logbook and felt, for the first time that day, entirely useless. Culberson came to stand beside me. He had the posture of a man who has become accustomed to standing near the wall and assessing things. Where'd you find her? Calder barn. He was quiet for a moment. New chain on that barn went up about a week ago, he said. I saw it from the trail, didn't think much of it. He paused. I should have thought more about it. So should I said. I almost didn't stop. But you did. Probable did first. Culberson looked at the horse through the window. Smarter than both of us then. Sacco's told us what she was willing to tell us in pieces over the course of that evening, and I understood that the pieces were chosen deliberately. Not that she was hiding things, but that she was making decisions about what information served which purpose, and offering it accordingly. The basic account. She had been traveling from the Eastern Territory alone for reasons she did not explain and which none of us asked about. She had stopped at a water source on the edge of the Calder property, the well, the one working well on those 40 acres, the one that made the property valuable even in its abandonment. 4 men had come while she was there. 3 she did not know. 1, the deputy, she recognized from a previous encounter she described only as unpleasant at the fort 2 years prior. They had taken her horse. They had bound her wrists. They had put her in the barn and locked the chain. What did they say they were going to do? Culberson asked. She held the warm basin and looked at the fire. They said they were deciding, she said. They seemed to be arguing about it. Arguing about what? What to do with me? She said this without any particular expression. There was disagreement. I could hear in the word disagreement all the weight of what that disagreement had meant to the woman sitting through it, locked in a barn, listening to men argue about what to do with her life. And then, Marta asked quietly. They left, Sacco said, and then they came back, and then they left again. The last time they came back was 3 days ago. One of them brought bread and water, left it by the door. They were still arguing. They brought provisions, I said. Yes, which means some of them intended for you to survive this, Culberson said. Or they could not agree on the alternative, she said. Silence in the room. The fire made its small sounds. The deputy, I said, what's his name? She looked at me. You know him. This county isn't large. Tell me his name and I'll know if I know him. She considered. Aldous, she said. I knew him, Carter Aldous, mid-30s, black mustache, the kind of man who wore his authority in the set of his shoulders before he opened his mouth. I had seen him twice, had spoken to him once, had written in my logbook afterward, Aldous, careful of. I did not always know why I wrote things at the time. Sometimes I found out later. I know him, I said. Then you understand the difficulty, she said. I did. Reporting to the sheriff meant reporting to a man whose office included Carter Aldous. In a county where the law was both the protection and the problem, the distance between justice and exposure was not always navigable. Here is what I did not fully understand that evening, that I began to understand over the days that followed. Sacco's was not simply a woman who had been locked in a barn. She was a woman who had been locked in a barn at a particular moment in a particular conflict over particular land that I had only the most superficial comprehension of. And the fact of the barn was a single, visible event sitting on top of a long and layered history that I did not have the context to read. I began to understand this because Sacco's taught me, in the patient, methodical way of someone who has decided that a specific person is worth the cost of explanation. She did not make this decision immediately. She spent the first night in the back room Marta prepared, and I spent it on Culberson's floor with my logbook open and half of it written in. And in the morning when I came out, she was already awake, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, Marta's doing, and looking out the window at the early light on the ridge. I sat across from her and opened my logbook. She looked at it. What do you write? What I see, I said. What I hear, what doesn't fit. And what fits? Most things eventually, I said. The ones that don't, I keep writing until they do. She turned the coffee cup in her hands, a slow rotation, a thinking gesture. You are a man who keeps a record, she said. My father kept records. In what form? In winter counts, she said. Pictures on hide. One image for each year, the most important thing that happened in that year. The year of the great snow, the year the horses came, the year, she paused. The year the boundary moved. The way she said the year the boundary moved. Not with anger. I want to be accurate about this, because it would be easier and perhaps more comfortable to say there was anger in it, something that would let me categorize it neatly. There wasn't anger. There was something more patient and more terrible than anger. The tone of a person stating a fact that has been true for so long it has become simply part of the description of the world. I didn't know winter counts were records, I said. Everything is a record, she said. You keep yours in a book, we kept ours in images. Both methods have the same problem. What problem? Who decides what is recorded, she said, and what is left out? I wrote that down, right then with her watching. What are you writing? She asked. I read it back to her. Who decides what is recorded, what is left out? She looked at it, nodded once. Good, she said. On the second day at Culberson's, we had a visitor. He arrived mid-morning, a young man I didn't know, on a horse I didn't recognize, who Culberson identified by the brand as coming from the Harlan operation to the north. He was perhaps 20, with the sunburned, earnest quality of someone who has recently been given a task he considers important and is perhaps slightly terrified of. He asked carefully if anyone had seen a missing horse, a pinto. Went missing about a week ago from a property near the Calder land. Culberson said he hadn't. I said nothing. The young man left. When he was gone, I looked at Culberson. Culberson looked at me. We both understood whoever had sent the young man wasn't looking for a horse, or not only for a horse. I went to the back room where Sacco's was. They're looking, I said. Yes, she said, as if this were information she'd been expecting. We need to decide what to do. I have already decided, she said. Tell me. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, and she had, at some point during her morning, rearranged her hair and repaired it into something deliberate and precise, and replaced the too large calico dress with one Marta had found that was close enough to fitting. The changes were small, but they communicated something. A reclamation, not of the things that had been taken, but of the self that had been present before the taking. There are people to the northwest, she said. 3 days riding, people who will know what I know about the men and the land and the argument they were having. She paused. If what I know reaches the right ears before they find me, the argument becomes much less interesting to resolve. You're going to report it, I said. To people who have authority to act on it, she said. Not to a sheriff who drinks with Aldous. That's a 3-day ride, I said. Alone, on probable since your horse. I know what a 3-day ride is, she said. I know you know, I said. I'm saying I'll go with you. She looked at me for a long moment. Why, she said. I thought about the honest answer again. It had the same shape it had the first time she'd asked me. I almost didn't stop. I did. Now stopping is a thing I've done and it has consequences and I'm not willing to stop stopping. I write things down, I said. I want to see how this ends. Something crossed her face. It was brief and I almost missed it. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something more complicated than that, the expression of a person encountering a response they had not fully anticipated and not yet knowing what to do with it. That is an unusual reason, she said. I'm an unusual man, I said. Ask my wife. We left at first light on the 3rd day. Culberson gave us provisions and the use of a second horse, a steady brown mare named Constance, and a route that avoided the main trail through Harlan's Ferry. Marta stood at the door as we rode out and said nothing, only raised her hand once in the particular gesture of someone who has already said in silence everything they have to say. The first day's riding was hard and quiet. Sacco's set the pace, which was efficient and consistent, and made no concessions to scenery or comfort. I kept up and kept my logbook in my pocket and tried to pay the kind of attention I'd trained myself to pay. What I noticed, she rode differently than I did, not better or worse, differently. A different relationship between rider and animal, more conversation and less command. A series of small, continuous adjustments that kept her and Constance in a negotiation rather than a hierarchy. I noticed she read the land the way I read the logbook. Her eyes moved constantly, taking inventory, checking things against an internal record I didn't have access to. I noticed, at a stream crossing mid-morning, she stopped and filled her hands with water and held them there for several seconds before drinking. Like the cold of the water was something she wanted to feel completely before she moved through it. I wrote, she knows where she is in a way I haven't learned yet. Like the land speaks to her in a language that still mostly sounds like noise to me. Around midday, without preamble, she said, the men in the barn, they were arguing about land. What land? There is an eastern portion of the Calder property that backs against territory that was guaranteed in the Treaty of 1867, she said. That guarantee has been contested. By whom? By anyone who wants that water source, she said. The well. I thought about it, the one working well on 40 acres of hardpan, the thing that made the property worth something even in its abandonment. And you're connected to the treaty claim. My uncle is one of the signatories' family, she said, or was. What I know about the original boundaries, what he told me, what I carry, makes me a witness to something they would prefer not to be witnessed. So they locked you away while they argued about what to do with a witness. Yes. The logic of it assembled itself in my head with an ugly clarity. Not random violence. Not simple hatred, though those were present. Specific, practical, strategic violence aimed at the suppression of specific, practical, strategic information. And if we get to the people to the northwest before they find us, then what I know is no longer only in me, she said. Then removing me resolves nothing. You've been planning this since the barn, I said. Since the 3rd day in the barn, she said. The first 2 I was still, she paused. I was still managing other things. I did not ask what the other things were. I knew the shape of them, the first cold hours in darkness, the inventory of survival, the mind running its emergency programs. The slow, terrible process of deciding not to stop. You could have told me sooner, I said. About the land, the treaty. You could have asked sooner, she said. Probable moved steadily beneath me. The land spread out on either side, dried grass, low hills, the bone-colored sky of late October. Fair, I said. She glanced at me sideways. Yes, she said. It is. We camped that night in a shallow draw with a good view of the approaches from the south. And Sakos built a fire that was small and positioned and entirely deliberate in its placement, in a way that I recognized was done with specific knowledge of wind direction and sight lines. I cooked. She let me cook, which I took as either a gesture of trust or an accurate assessment of who had the provisions. Over the fire, she told me about her father's winter counts. Not everything. I understood that she was giving me portions of a larger thing and that the portions were chosen, but enough. The years she had lived through counted in images. The year the spotted sickness came, the year the horses multiplied, the year the soldiers came to the summer camp, the year her father drew a boundary on the hide with one line and labeled it what was, and with another line labeled it what they said. What we said and what was were not the same, I asked. They are never the same, she said. The question is only who gets to make the record. Who gets to make the record? I wrote it in the firelight while she watched. My account, I said. About finding you, about the barn and the chain and what you've told me about the land. Does that help? She looked at the fire. It might, she said. If you are honest about what you saw and what you did not see. I'll be honest about both. People usually find the second harder, she said. What they did not see, what they were not paying attention to, the chain that was there for a week before you noticed it. The chain that had been there for a week, while she was inside, while I was taking the creek trail before it washed out, while 4 miles was 4 miles and an abandoned barn was none of my business. Yes, I said, that part will be harder to write. But you will write it. I'll write it. She looked at me across the fire, and the expression that crossed her face was not quite the same as the one from the morning. This one was quieter, less surprised. Something more like the beginning of a provisional trust, which is the most honest kind. All right, Marsh, she said, then perhaps your record will be useful. On the second morning, we found evidence on the trail behind us. A fire recent, the ash still faintly warm when I held my hand near it. 2 horses from the tracks, coming from the south, moving north. We didn't speak about it, we moved faster. The landscape around us had been changing, lower hills giving way to higher, the grass giving way to pinyon and juniper, the smell of the air shifting from dry grass to resin. Sakos moved through it with increasing recognition, and I understood that we were coming into country she knew better than the country we'd left behind. Late on the second afternoon, she said, I want to ask you something. Ask. When you found me in the barn, she said, what did you think? I considered the honest answer. I thought you were going to die if I didn't get you out, I said, and then I thought I should get you out, and then I got you out. And after I searched for the right word. Revised, I said. Something in how I understood things was revised. She rode in silence for a moment. What was revised, she asked. The map I had of what was happening in this county, I said. The chain was new. The chain being new meant someone had done something recently. I had a map that didn't include that. You revised the map. Maps are like records, she said, depending on who draws them. Yes. The people who drew the maps of this territory, she said, did not include what was already here. No, I said, they didn't. What do you think they saw when they looked? I thought about it honestly. I think they saw nothing, I said, and then they saw an opportunity, and the nothing was convenient. She was quiet for a long moment. The horses moved through the juniper. My uncle told me something, she said finally. He said, the most dangerous blindness is not the blindness of the man who closes his eyes. It is the blindness of the man who looks and records what he looks at and genuinely believes he has recorded everything. I sat with that. I know that man, I said. You are a version of that man, she said, not unkindly. The precision of a person naming a fact. I know, I said. But you are a version who noticed when something didn't fit. Probable noticed first. She made a sound, not quite a laugh, but adjacent, the first I'd heard from her that wasn't controlled. Then write that down too, she said. Give the horse the credit. I wrote it down. We were close on the evening of the second day, when I heard hooves behind us. Not far, a quarter mile, maybe less, in the juniper. Sakos heard them at the same time I did. She didn't look back. She looked forward at the terrain ahead, and she made a decision I could see her making without being able to see her face. There is a path, she said, to the east narrow. The horses will need to go single file. And it leads to where we are going, she said, but not by the route they would know. How much farther? Less than an hour, she said, if we move now. I looked back once. The juniper was still and dark and gave nothing away. Move, I said. She moved. The path was exactly as narrow as she'd said. I want to record it accurately. Single file, the rock walls close enough on either side that my elbows touched stone. The path climbing in a series of switchbacks through the juniper and into a higher, cooler air that smelled of pine and something mineral and old. Sakos went first with Constance, reading the path from memory or something older than memory, some knowledge held in the body that doesn't need to consult itself, and Probable followed with the reliable faith of a horse who has decided the creature ahead of him knows where she's going. I held my breath at turns, not from fear exactly, but from the feeling of the walls close and the dark coming on and the hoofbeats somewhere below us that may have been following, and may have stopped when the path was too narrow to follow, or may have been waiting at the bottom for us to emerge on the other side. I wrote nothing. My hand was busy with the reins. The path opened after 40 minutes. Abruptly, without warning, the rock walls falling away and the sky expanding overhead and the smell of smoke and something cooking reaching us before anything was visible. Then the firelight. Not one fire, several. A settlement. I don't have a better word that isn't freighted with the wrong implications. A place where people had been for a very long time, which was evident in the way the structures sat in the landscape, not imposed on it, but incorporated into it. The shelters using the rock faces as walls and the pinion as roof supports and the natural configuration of the terrain as architecture. Dogs heard us first, then people. Sakos dismounted before we reached the first fire, and I followed her lead and dismounted too, and she called out in her language. Words I didn't know, but that arrived and were answered by a voice from the direction of the largest fire, and then we were walking toward it. The man who came out to meet us was older than I'd expected and younger than he seemed, if that makes sense. A man whose age lived not in his face but in his eyes, in the way he looked at Sakos first, and made a sound in his throat that was complicated and controlled and communicated something I couldn't translate, then looked at me with an assessment so thorough, and so rapid that I felt, briefly, the way Probable had felt when Sakos first approached him. Scented, evaluated, provisionally accepted. He spoke to her. She answered. The exchange went for a while, and I stood with my reins in my hand and my logbook in my breast pocket, and the fire warm on my left side and the night cold on my right, and I practiced paying attention in the way I'd trained myself, not waiting to understand, just observing. What I observed, the exchange had weight. Her words had weight. She was not giving an account. She was delivering something, evidence, intelligence, the kind of information that changes decisions. What I observed, he listened without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment, and then he spoke one sentence. She translated for me. He says you are the man who opened the barn. I am, I said. He looked at me and said something else. He says the door was already loose, she translated. He says the door was loose because someone loosened it 3 weeks ago. I stared at her. Someone on the inside, I said. Someone on the outside, she said. Someone who knew what might happen and wanted to make sure that if it did, the door could be broken. The chain had been new. The hasp the chain was fitted to had been rotted enough that it pulled free with 4 strikes of a rock that I had congratulated myself for thinking to use. Rotted or weakened, made to look secure while being made to be broken. Who, I said. She translated the question. The older man looked at me and answered. He says he doesn't know, she said. But he says it was probably one of the men who was arguing about what to do with me. One of the 4 who locked you in. One of the four wanted to make sure I could be found, she said. If not by the right people, then at least, eventually, by someone. I thought about probable stopping. The absolute rigid certainty of an animal who had heard something 60 yards away that resolved the question of whether to keep riding. Or by someone with a horse that pays attention, I said. I want to be careful about what comes next, because it would be easy to write it as a simple thing. A resolution, a clear outcome, the satisfying click of a mechanism resolving, and it wasn't that. What happened over the next several hours in that settlement in the Pinions was complicated in ways I only partially understood then, and understand somewhat better now, which means there are still portions I'm recording without fully comprehending. What happened? Sakos gave her account to the older man, who was. I understood gradually, through context, and through the translations Sakos offered me when she chose to. A person of specific authority within the community regarding exactly the kind of land records and treaty knowledge she carried. What she knew, told to him, was no longer only in her. What she knew was now, to use the language of the law that had created the problem, in record. Other people came to the fire as the evening continued. I sat on the outer edge and wrote in my logbook and tried not to perform uselessness too obviously. At some point food appeared. I ate what I was given without asking what it was, because I have a rule about hospitality that my mother taught me, and that has served me well in the variety of circumstances I found myself in. Around what I estimated was the middle of the night, Sakos came and sat beside me. They will send people south tomorrow, she said, to the county seat, to people who are not Aldis. Federal, I asked. There are people in the territorial office who have reason to take this seriously, she said. The Treaty of 67 is still contested. What I know, what he now knows, adds to a set of documentation that was already being assembled. This was already in motion, I said. My trip, she said, was already in motion before they stopped me at the well. They stopped me to stop the motion. And instead it accelerated it, I said, because you survived, because you're here. She looked at the fire. Because someone loosened the hasp, she said, and because your horse stopped. I wrote that down, because someone loosened the hasp, because probable stopped. Chains of events so improbable they feel inevitable in retrospect. What will you do now? I asked. Stay here for a time, she said. Wait to see what the people at the county seat do with what I've told. And if Aldis moves first? He may, she said. That is a risk that exists. She turned the question back without deflection. What will you do? Go home, I said. Write all of this down clearly. Send a copy to my wife's brother in the territorial capital. He's a lawyer, the careful kind. A careful kind, she said. Are there others? Many, I said. Also useless kinds, but him I trust. She looked at me with the provisional trust that had been building since the second night's fire, which had not resolved into something full and unambiguous, but which had settled into something real. Then do that, she said. The careful documentation of a private citizen who witnessed specific events is not nothing. No, I said, it's not nothing. I left at sunrise. I want to write this part carefully, because it is easy to make it into something it wasn't. There was no dramatic farewell. Sakos was awake when I prepared probable for the ride south. She was standing near the eastern edge of the settlement in the early light, looking toward the ridge where the day was beginning to come in. When I brought probable around, she turned and looked at me. The logbook, she said. I'll keep it. All of it, she said, including the week the chain was there before you noticed, including the 4 miles. Including all of that, I said. She nodded once. I mounted, started to turn probable. Marsh, she said. I stopped. She was looking at me with the same expression she'd had at the very beginning. The first assessment in the dark of the barn, when her eyes had met mine and not flinched. But there was something in it now that hadn't been there in the barn, something that had accumulated over 3 days of riding and firelight and the gradual, costly exchange of information. She said, the word Sakos, I told you it means cold wind. Yes. What I did not tell you, she said, is that cold wind is not a bad thing in our understanding. It is the wind that clears. That comes after the heat of summer and moves through everything and changes the conditions for what grows next. I sat with that. All right, I said. Write that down too, she said. I will. I turned probable south and began the ride home. The ride back took 2 days. On the first day I rode in silence and wrote nothing, which was unusual for me. The logbook stayed in my pocket while I let the landscape and the events of the past week settle into the various compartments of my understanding. I was trying to locate the shape of what had happened, the way you try to find the shape of something large by walking its edges. What I found: there was the event, the barn, the chain, the woman, the 5 or 6 days, the ride north. That was visible. That had edges I could walk. There was the thing beneath the event. The land, the well, the Treaty of 67, the argument among 4 men that was really an argument about whether the quiet suppression of a witness was worth the particular calculation they were each running. That was less visible. I had edges for some of it. Others I'd only glimpsed. There was the thing beneath that. The longer record, the winter counts. The maps that didn't include what was already there. The chain of decisions and absences and convenient blindnesses that had arrived, eventually, at a barn with a new lock, and a woman inside who had decided not to die as an act of spite. That thing I had no edges for. I could see it at edges. I couldn't walk them all. On the second day, I wrote. I wrote the full account from the beginning: probable stopping, the new chain, the dark barn, the rope burns, the deliberate drinking. I wrote about Sako standing in the October light with her eyes closed and her hand opening and closing. About the coffee cup turning in her hands. About the fire she built in the draw, small and positioned and deliberate. I wrote about the chain that had been there for a week before I noticed it. I wrote about the 4 miles. I wrote it all down, and when I finished, I read it through once, and then I wrote at the bottom, cold wind, the kind that clears. I was home by early evening on the second day. My wife met me at the gate. She has an instinct for when I'm arriving that I've never been able to fully explain. And she looked at me in the particular way she has of reading a situation before reacting to it, which is where I suspect Culberson learned it, or perhaps simply where both of them arrived independently through similar temperament. You look like something happened, she said. Something happened, I said. She took Probable's reins so I could dismount. Is the logbook full? Closed, I said. Then come inside, she said. Tell me. I followed her inside and sat down at the table and opened the logbook to the first page of what I'd written. This is going to take a while, I said. I know, she said. Start at the beginning. Probable stopped, I said. I almost didn't get down. I want to end this account here at the table because that is where the account belongs, not at the dramatic high point, not at the satisfying resolution, but at the place where the writing down begins in earnest. Where someone sits across from you and says, start at the beginning, and you understand that the beginning is not the barn and not the chain, but something considerably further back, in a time before you arrived, and that your account, however careful, however honest, will only ever be a partial accounting of a much longer story that was already in motion. Sako's people sent their documentation south. Aldous was removed from his position in the following spring. I did not learn the specific reason officially, and I am careful in this account not to claim certainty I don't have, but the timing was what it was. The land question regarding the eastern portion of the Calder property, the question of the well, the treaty boundary, the guarantee of 1867, remained contested for several more years. I do not know its current resolution or if it has one. These things move slowly and not always toward the right. What I know, my wife's brother took the copy of my account and added it to a larger file that already existed, and he told me afterward that it was not the only eyewitness account in that file, and that the file was being read by people with authority to act on it. Whether they did, I cannot say with certainty. What I know, Culberson put a new padlock on his trading post that winter with a new hasp, and made sure both were fitted to good solid wood. What I know, Probable got an extra portion of grain every evening from late October through spring, which I maintained was compensation, and which my wife maintained was sentiment, and which was probably both.